Seller beware, these are the three contingencies that cause sellers the most headache and heartache in our Oregon real estate forms. Here are the three contingencies that sellers should be aware of when they're accepting an offer using our Oregon real estate forms. First thing I should let you know is that we actually have two sets of forms now in Oregon, and I'm talking about the OREF, the Oregon Real Estate Forms, which we've been using for years and years in Oregon, not about the Oregon Realtors Forms, which just showed up this year. And when I'm talking about contingencies, what I'm referring to are clauses in the contract that allow a buyer to cancel the contract, preserve their earnest money, and walk away. The first one up is the review of the preliminary title report, and I call this one more of a soft contingency. And the reason that I call it a soft contingency is that a buyer can't just simply terminate unilaterally, take their earnest money and walk. They actually have to give the seller the possibility to fix whatever defect they're finding in the title report. So a common example of this would be maybe there's an easement attached to the title of that property that it's for the benefit of the neighbor to use a certain section of the property for a road or a fence or a well or something like that. And the buyer sees that and they say, hey, I'm not okay with that. I want to terminate. They do actually have to give the seller the ability to fix whatever defect is there to the buyer's satisfaction, and if the seller can't or refuses to do that, if they can't go to the neighbor and say, hey, I'll give you $3,000 if you release this easement or something like that, then at that point the buyer can take their earnest money, and they're within their rights to take their earnest money, their good faith money, and walk. The second one up is one that most people I think are aware of, which is the home inspection contingency. One thing that's a little bit funny about ours in the OREF forms is that in a lot of states, and I believe that Washington and California are like this, you kind of have two different time periods in their time frames in there. One is the buyer's due diligence time frame, where they can bring in inspectors and contractors and so on and so forth and do all sorts of inspections to make sure that the home is up to their standards and that they discover whatever defects might be problems for them. And then there's a second time period where there's a bit of negotiating that might go on between the buyer and the seller regarding repairs or maybe credits in lieu of repairs. In Oregon, that's all in one time frame. It's all jammed into one. We typically have, like a 5 business day or 10 business day time frame for both the due diligence and the negotiating. And once we hit 5 p.m. on that last business day, or however we write it in the contract, that's it. It's a passive acceptance. If the buyer goes past that time period, 5 p.m. on that date, they're accepting the property as is, where is, with no exceptions, unless they have some sort of agreement regarding repairs or credits in lieu of repairs with the seller before 5 p.m. at that time period. And the reason that this can be kind of stressful to sellers is that we can come down to the wire, be negotiating back and forth, and without an extension of that expiration, boom, the buyer drops a termination in the seller's lap at the last hour, says, hey, I'm done, we're canceling, we're taking our earnest money and walking away, leaving the seller sitting there thinking, I still wanted to negotiate some more. And that simply can't happen the way the language is written in those OREF forms, unless the buyer and seller agree to an extension, which is what typically does happen in those cases. But if it comes down to the wire and there's no extension, and the buyer's worried about losing their earnest money, and there's no agreement on repairs or credits, boom, they'll drop the hammer, terminate, take their earnest money and walk. The third one up is the one that causes the most problems and heartache for sellers, and that's the finance contingency. And I'll get into why this can be a real big problem in just a second. But the finance contingency has two parts. One is the property has to qualify for the loan. So if we're doing a loan that's like an FHA or a VA loan where the appraiser has somewhat of a mandate to make sure that the home is habitable, they don't want to see any dry rot, they don't want to see any exposed wood, they don't want to see cracked windows, they want to make sure that there's good ventilation over the stove if it's a gas stove, the water heater strapped in, blah, 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 blah. So there's lots and lots of things that a VA or an FHA appraiser could call out that would disqualify the home from a loan without the seller doing some repairs. So the home qualifying for the loan, that also means that it has to appraise at value. And if it doesn't appraise at value and the seller's not willing to drop the asking price to match what the appraised amount is, or the buyer's not willing to bring in some extra funds to make up the difference, then the buyer at that point can terminate, take their good faith money, their earnest money, and walk away at that point because the home failed to qualify for the loan. The second half of that, though, this is the one where it gets really tough, is that the buyer has to qualify for the loan. And where this can really be a problem for the seller is if we're dealing with maybe a lender that's not paying a lot of attention to what's going on with the loan. Could be, online internet lenders are a bit notorious for this. A lender that's got a call center that the borrower is calling in, and there's the first person that took all their financial information and just put it in a file. Then there's a second person. Once there was a contract, they locked the rate and they did a couple of things. They reviewed the title report and they ordered the appraisal and stuff like that. And then there's a third person. Once that appraisal comes in, lands on the desk of the underwriter, this third person who is looking at this file for the very first time. And given how our contracts are set up, we could be 3 weeks into the transaction by this time. And here's the underwriter looking at the borrower's financials for the very first time. This is not an uncommon practice. It happens a lot. And they are taking a couple of days and they're trying to get some clarification from the buyer, and something doesn't sit right. And at that point, the lender gives the buyer a loan denial. They reject the buyer for the loan. And we could be, 2 or 3 days shy of the closing date at that point. And here comes the buyer with this loan denial. And, between the buyer and the seller, maybe there's no way to fix this, to work this out, to make it work. And the buyer, under that finance contingency, is saying, hey, I failed to qualify for the loan. I'm going to take my earnest money and walk. And the seller's there just thinking, what just happened? We're 3 or 4 days away from the closing date, and the buyer's walking away with the earnest money, and the seller's saying, hey, I want that earnest money. This isn't right. How could this happen? And it happened just because of what is written in that finance contingency and how a lot of these bigger online lenders or big institutional lenders that operate with a call center somewhere in Cleveland or some East Coast state or Southern California, with a Portland lender, more often than not, the local lender, whether they're at Bank of America or Wells Fargo or one of our favorite loan brokerage companies like Directors or Guild or Fairway or something like that, those folks will typically underwrite the borrower before they even issue the pre-approval letter, where some of other banks are doing that backwards. As a listing agent, one of the things that I always do when we get an offer that looks like something that the seller might accept is I call up that mortgage broker. I ask a few questions. First one is, do you know these folks? And number two is, what have you looked at? What have you reviewed? Have you pulled credit? Have you double-checked their income and financials? And how far along they are, because that can help inform the seller and me about how this could go down going forward. So that's it. 3 big contingencies that a seller should be aware of when they're accepting an offer with Oregon Real Estate Forums. If you happen to have any questions, just leave a comment down below. I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions, and I'd love a thumbs up. And if you haven't followed this channel, please push that subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time.